Then does the U.S. running the country mean that U.S. troops will be on the ground? How will that work?
Well, they always say boots on the ground. Oh, so we're not afraid of boots on the ground if we have to have. We had boots on the ground last night at a very high level, actually. We're not afraid of it. We don't mind saying it.
If you're okay with the idea of boots on the ground in Venezuela, are you sure you know what you're getting into? There's been some, but there hasn't been a lot of on the ground reporting about the security situation in Venezuela and who the violent actors in the country might be, especially if there's a U.S. deployment of troops in the country. Surely, though, if you're a member of Congress, you wouldn't want to just, give a green light, a blank check to the Trump administration to sleepwalk into a big, complicated new commitment, would you? You'd at least want to make sure that Congress gets to sign off first, right? Hi, I'm Adam Isaacson. I work for the Washington office on Latin America. That's a human rights group based in D.C. We've been around for more than 50 years. We're a small organization, we're independent, and we have an excellent Venezuela and communications team. I'm recording this on Monday, January 12th, and there could be a new vote in the U.S. Senate within a few days on a resolution that simply says that there can be no further military action in Venezuela without Congress's approval. So I wanted to get out this message. I'm thinking about senators who might be either gung-ho to give Donald Trump a green light to use the military in Venezuela, but I'm also thinking about senators who maybe you're on the fence. Maybe you're worried about where the Trump administration is going in Venezuela, what the plan is, but maybe you haven't made a decision yet. Now, there was a decision made preliminarily on January 8th. There were 47 senators, I'm thinking very much about them right now, who voted against a motion just to start considering this Venezuela War Powers resolution. 47 senators said no. Go ahead, Mr. President, send the military in without demanding Congress's prior approval. But 5 Republicans joined the Democrats in this resolution to move it forward. Now the resolution has to get debated, and there'll be another final vote in the coming days. And that's where it would be great to have Congress assert itself more strongly than it already has, because there's a risk of getting the military into something larger than expected. So, where are we right now? I mean, let's all celebrate the fact that some prisoners have been released. That is wonderful. Let's all celebrate the fact that Nicolas Maduro, who is a deeply corrupt and cruel man, is no longer running Venezuela. However, the plan appears to be to work with the rest of Maduro's regime for now. Secretary Marco Rubio is talking about some sort of transition phase and that there'll be overtures to the opposition, but it's really not clear how they're planning to get from here to there. And Donald Trump, for the most part, when he's asked, he's mostly talking about oil and taking over Venezuela's oil industry and having U.S. oil companies and U.S. government calling the shots. So, there are some very real scenarios that could cause U.S. forces to be deployed to Venezuela, whether they're trying to install the Democratic opposition that won elections that were stolen in 2024, but they don't control the security forces, so that could be complicated for a while, or whether the current government in Venezuela remains in place, but they fragment because not all of these people who supported the former government like the idea of doing the Trump administration's bidding. Or maybe they simply just can't hold the security situation together, or about to talk about how complicated it is in the country. Or even if it's just to guard the oil infrastructure, even if they're only doing that, U.S. troops, as they benefit U.S. companies, could find themselves under attack. You can imagine some really plausible scenarios where the Trump administration might end up just sleepwalking the military into a big, complicated new engagement in Venezuela. Congress really does need to know what the plan is, and not just to give a big green light to improvisation. So, Venezuela, it's a country of perhaps 28 million people. Another 8 million or so actually left the country in the last 10 years, which is just a shocking amount. In land area, Venezuela is the size of Texas plus Utah put together. It is a big country with more complicated terrain. It has a lot of jungles, a lot of mountain ranges, a huge river system. But even beyond size, Venezuela is a place where the capacity to carry out violence is pretty dispersed. The Maduro government was a kleptocratic state, but it was full of armed fiefdoms, and a lot of symbiotic relationships existed with armed and criminal groups outside the state that were quite wealthy and powerful. So this loose network hung together for many years because most of its members were benefiting from the status quo. They were getting rich, they were powerful, they enjoyed the bits of power that they had. A government in the future, or a future U.S. occupier that disrupts that status quo, is going to deal with some violent and well-funded opponents. And I'm not talking about a civil war. I wouldn't use that term. I wouldn't even consider it necessarily to be a massive war of all against all violence all over the country. In fact, the violent adversaries that an occupier might face in a future scenario here might be quite unpopular inside Venezuela. That doesn't always matter, though. They can do a lot of damage because they have access to resources from everything from cocaine that's mostly made in Colombia and transshipped through Venezuela, to illicit precious metals mining, to kidnapping and extortion, human trafficking, and many other income streams. So who am I talking about that's benefited from the status quo and has weapons? I'm talking about the armed forces, perhaps 150,000 members. Nobody really knows. I haven't seen any hard estimates that everybody swears by, but the estimates I give here for all of these groups are based on secondary sources and sort of credible analysts' ballpark estimates. The armed forces have a ridiculously high number of generals and colonels. You can roughly double their entire number if you add elements of the National Guard and the police. The police have some really murderous elite units within them as well. Then you've got the intelligence services, especially DEHESIM and SEBIN, counterintelligence, intelligence, human trained, responsible for massive human rights violations, torture, quite ideological. No really good estimates again, but between DEHESIM and SEBIN and elite police units, I've seen maybe about 30,000 members populated for those services. Then there are colectivos, which are not formally part of the government. They started out sort of as usually left-wing political activists or service groups, but many of them took up weapons and became deeply ideological in support of the regime. Not all, but probably most, are now armed and almost a paramilitary force. You see these images of men on motorcycles carrying rifles, terrorizing usually urban neighborhoods that they know pretty well. They're very active, and they probably have nationwide maybe 100,000 members around the country, this paramilitary force loyal to the regime. Now, the Maduro government and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, set up citizen militias as well. They armed lots of citizens, gave them at least some rudimentary military training. You see a lot of pictures of even elderly and people who are maybe not perfectly physically fit, carrying weapons, maybe weapons that have seen better days. So it's not clear how much of a threat the militias are to a future occupier, although their size is estimated at least 1 million people around the country who are technically members of the militias. So they're supposed to be part of a resistance if there's ever like a foreign occupier or a government that the Maduro government did not like. I don't think you'd see 1 million people taking up arms in this scenario, but I've seen estimates of perhaps a hardcore of maybe 20,000 militia members who could form a more effective part of a resistance. So that's what's really, kind of officially or closely aligned with the state. And then you've got Venezuelan criminal groups that have benefited from this whole status quo. The prison system is heavily influenced, in part dominated by groups called pranes, organized crime groups that operate out of the jails. You've got so-called mega bandas, which are large organized crime groups. Tren de Aragua is probably the best known example of a mega banda, but there are others. And then you've got Colombian groups, armed and criminal groups. Colombia has had an armed conflict since the 1960s with leftist guerrilla groups, pro-government or right-wing paramilitary groups, all of that funded by drug traffickers and other illicit income streams. It's hugely complicated. One group in particular, the National Liberation Army, or ELN, has been around since the mid-1960s. It's really a binational group now. It controls a big chunk of the common border between Colombia and Venezuela and is quite active inside Venezuela. They have perhaps 6,500 fighters in both countries. It could be that maybe half or more are inside Venezuela and are, in fact, many of them are, in fact, Venezuelan citizens. They've gotten to be quite wealthy, particularly by exploiting precious metals mining in the southern part of Venezuela. And of course, the Colombian groups, because of their own armed conflict, are much more combat hardened. They would pose a real threat to any future government or occupier in Venezuela that they don't like. So take all of that together. That's quite a list of generators of violence, potential generators of violence. And you've got, I don't know, conservatively, maybe 1.5 million people. Let's just say that only 5% of that 1.5 million, very conservatively, 5% of them decide that they're going to take up arms and aim them at whoever's running Venezuela in the next year or so. And whoever is running Venezuela could be, again, partially at least, U.S. troops. 5%, a very, very conservative estimate. That's 75,000 people armed, funded by drug trafficking and other income streams. That is a huge security challenge, and it could be loose, networked, leaderless, asymmetrical, like a lot of the organized crime groups that are doing so much harm in places like Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico. But they could be a problem for whoever is trying to keep order in Venezuela, who, again, could be U.S. military personnel, especially if Congress doesn't make clear that it has to authorize this mission. So by comparison, Colombia, neighboring country, at the height of its armed conflict in the late 90s, early 2000s, a time when armed groups, by some intelligence estimates, were actually within, a few years of actually taking over power in the country. At that point, Colombia actually had fewer armed group members than 75,000. You had the FARC and ELN guerrillas, maybe about 25,000 fighters total, plus support networks. Paramilitaries, maybe 30,000. The regular drug cartels and gangs had a few thousand more, but you're talking maybe 50, 60,000 people in Colombia's armed groups at the time. So a similar challenge to what Venezuela might face. Venezuela's could even be greater because I'm giving very conservative estimates here. Now, Colombia's groups were hated. They were very unpopular. When the FARC guerrillas demobilized in 2017 and 2018, they became a political party and ran in congressional elections. That party got 0.3% of the vote. They were hated, unpopular because they were so violent and had carried out so many human rights abuses. But it didn't matter. They were still an enormous security challenge for the Colombian armed forces because of their wealth and their capacity to carry out attacks, often very dramatic attacks, often attacks on oil infrastructure, which have happened at least 1,300 times in the last 15 years, and which could be a huge problem for Venezuela in the future. The question is whether the U.S. military might find itself carrying out a mission that could keep increasing in size and scope, because the Venezuelan state might not be able to handle security on its own, a big U.S. military mission without any real evidence that the Trump administration has thought through where this could go. So look, there's perhaps many senators here in Washington who aren't worried about this. They think it's just not worth enduring Donald Trump's wrath by disagreeing with him. But I suspect that a lot of senators are genuinely worried about the incredibly vague plans, or lack of plans, that we're hearing from the administration right now, especially as it might involve the young men and women in our military. And for those senators, I share this information about what might lie ahead for any future military intervention, because really it could be pretty bad. So there's really nothing wrong with demanding that before the administration takes our armed forces down a potential slippery slope, that Congress first demands that it gets to sign off on it. That's all that the War Powers Resolution is calling for. Please vote for it, and please let's all be smart in 2026.